Welcome to Healthcare IT Today. I'm John Lynn, together with my colleague and friend, Colin Hung. The world of technology and healthcare are ever-changing in new and novel ways, and that's why we love this stuff. So join us as we discuss the latest healthcare and health IT news, meshed together in new ways which help generate ideas and new perspectives. Plus, we'll have a little fun along the way. On today's episode, we'll be talking about the 2020 presidential election and its impact on health IT. And be sure to follow the show on Twitter at the hashtag HITSM and our personal accounts at TechGuy and at Colin_Hung. Plus, check out our 14 years of health IT blog content at healthcareittoday.com. Man, this topic, we record these 3 or 4 weeks in advance, right? So the election will be happening tomorrow if you're listening to it at Healthcare IT Today, and it's in 2 weeks if you're listening on Healthcare Now Radio. So, these are, really advanced predictions, so a lot could happen, but should be a fun discussion today.
It should, and we're venturing into a territory that we normally don't go into, of course, which is politics. But we won't really be debating the politics of it, but just more of, what's going on with health IT. And I think, as you and I were talking before we started recording, John, one of the things that we were both surprised at, maybe not surprised, maybe disappointed at, is the fact that healthcare as a whole, other than COVID, is really not something that's being debated or discussed or on any of the platforms of the major parties right now. Everything is just focused on the COVID pandemic. Maybe that's okay, but it would have been nice to have some other discussions around, Medicare for all and, pre-existing conditions and all these other things that are, of course, part of healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from on the disappointment and the distractions that's kind of happening, but I'm also not disappointed because it kind of feels like we've had these discussions and it just feels like we're retreading the same topics over and over and over again. And there's two ideological differences on both sides of how to approach healthcare. And so, in some ways, I'm kind of glad we're not going through it because it feels like Groundhog Day a little bit, right? And I think that is the one element that has been somewhat discussed, which is the Medicare for all. It happened more back when Bernie was in the race and, during the Democratic primaries and things like that. Hasn't been as much because it is so ideologically different than, what Trump is talking about and what the Democratic Biden, et cetera, is talking about. They're so different that, it's almost not even worth the discussion because they are so completely different. The only exception too is I have seen some ads that I think that the Trump campaign has put out saying that Biden and them were going to do Medicare for all. And my prediction is that's not what's going to happen. I don't think there's support, at least not yet, for Medicare for all. And I don't think that's the proposal that Biden would bring to the table if he's elected president. I don't think he's going to go all in with Medicare for all. Instead, I think he'll bring essentially an Obamacare plus, if you will, like Obamacare with maybe a few additional items.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think, I talk about it a lot coming from the country where we do have universal health care, at least for primary care and for acute care. And I think there has to be sort of times in history and culturally where, you have that one for all for one kind of feeling where a Medicare for all can be passed, right? And we're not in that moment, clearly, in the US. And I don't think we're like that anywhere in the world where the countries are feeling so homogenous and together that we could pass something. I mean, Canada passed its law for universal healthcare back when the World War had just finished, right? And so at that moment in history, you're like, yeah, like we're all together, we're supporting each other, and that was sort of one of the few times in history where you could have passed it, right? I don't think now, had Canada not done that way back when, I don't think we would have be able to pass it now. We're just not the world isn't the same kind of place.
So are you saying we're not united right now? Is it?
Yeah. Surprisingly, we're not really that united as a world. But I do think I agree with you. I think that no matter I think if the Democrats win, I think what they'll do is sort of nip at the edges, right? So they'll be a little bit more inclusive and they'll have more people be able to get on Medicare and Medicaid, or there'll be more programs available. So it won't be Medicare for all, but it'll be Medicare for more. Right. And I think that's sort of a reasonable approach to to it, as opposed to, the Republicans, who are obviously more interested in going back and repealing that a little bit, shrinking the Medicare and Medicaid budgets so that it's under control, and doing other things to try and supplement that, which a lot of people would view, I think, or the ones that are on it right now would view as a step backwards, but they are approaching it much more from a fiscally responsible way, I guess, to try and curb that big giant spend, which is Medicare and Medicaid.
Yeah, well, I think if we look at the Democrats' approach, it'll likely be something, the furthest they may be able to get is a government option, which has been talked about quite a bit. And I could see them doing essentially a lot of the things that were in Obamacare plus a government option. I'm not sure if that would pass or not. I think it's still a bit controversial. But what that means for health IT organizations is that there could be more competition in the payer side if they did make it to that. And I think there would be interesting opportunities available to health IT companies if the Democrats win and there is this new influx of spending around healthcare, which is fascinating. It's like, oh yeah, this is going to be a savings program, but we're going to spend, and I think that's the reality with some of the coverages that are there. And actually, I don't know, maybe we'll get into the issues of why stuff costs so much with drug pricing and other things, right? As opposed to coverage actually lowering the cost of healthcare. So I think that's the Democrat side that could impact healthcare IT organizations. I think if you look at the Republican side and what Trump has tried to do and what Republicans have tried to do, I still go back to, I think it was HIMSS maybe 3 or 4 years ago, 2-3 years ago. I forget how many years. And Boehner was there and he was being interviewed and they were talking, I think it was right after the election or something like that. And he's like, I don't know why people thought that Republicans were going to be able to pass something. He's like, Republicans have never agreed on how to fix healthcare. And I heard that and I'm just like, yeah, that's where we're at today. And, I think that's true in the Republican Party. And that's why they haven't passed a replacement to Obamacare or any other sort of healthcare legislation. And that's what I think Trump is faced with, that a lot of Republicans don't agree on what's needed to fix the healthcare situation, which we all know is too expensive and we're paying too much.
Yeah, I think, ironically, the one area where I think they both agree, although they'll never admit it, of course, is, reduction in drug prices. That, I think both parties will agree that there's something wrong there, something needs to be done there to protect Americans from high drug prices and the gouging and the profit taking that has happened in more recent years, right?
Yeah.
Trump has taken aim at it. Biden has talked about it. Ironically, that's the one area of healthcare where they can both agree that says there's something broken, we need to fix it. So no matter who wins the election in a few weeks or tomorrow, depending on when you're listening to this, I think that the drug companies are in for a little bit of change, because I think that will eventually become something that they'll take aim at, both parties. I mean, after we get through COVID and of course with the vaccines, I think once that dies down, I think they'll relook at drug pricing and the way that that's done in the U.S. because certainly in the current situation with COVID, with so many people losing their employment and losing coverage, we're hearing a lot more stories up here in Canada around mass imports or mass exports of drugs from countries like Canada to the United States, just because the prices are magnitudes different for everything from insulin to other types of cancer drugs. I mean, it's unbelievable, the cost difference, and all it is just a step over a border, right?
Yeah, and it's hard to say where that's going to go because the pharma lobbies are so powerful and influential. And so, I have no predictions on that. I wish something would happen because you look at the prices and it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I remember dealing with this when I worked at a healthcare organization. We had a pharmacy and they said, we have to charge AWP plus $2.95. I was like, why? The drug costs you $2 to buy. Well, if we go to the insurance company and we charge them $5 rather than AWP, which is average wholesale price, then they won't pay us. I'm like, okay, I guess that makes sense. And sure, you might as well charge the higher amount, but man, it just so much about that just doesn't make sense. But I also think it's a really challenging problem to solve. and the lobbies are against it. Now, that said, there has been a lot more conversation around it and realization that there are some issues here. So I'm hopeful that they'll do something as well. But on the front for health IT companies, I think if Republicans get elected, it's more of the same. I don't think that there's going to be that much change. They're not going to see massive legislation. The Democrats will still hold the House, and so they really won't be able to pass anything. So I think that's interesting. If the Democrats sweep everything, that will be, we'll be in for some big changes and some things that a lot of health IT companies are going to have to deal with. Of course, if the Republicans hold the Senate, well, then we're kind of into stalemate again. So, anyway, it'll be interesting to watch.
But I think, there are some things that I think will continue, right? The whole information blocking legislation and
For
all
sure.
those will still happen. I mean, those are, first of all, they're too far below party lines, right? Like that's just more of an administrivia or administration. So I think those are still going forward. So I think those that were maybe hoping that maybe one or the other might cancel that or rejig it, I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're pretty much going to go forward as they are currently set. Might be some commentary or adjustment here and there, but I think a lot of those things are already on the rails and already well down the track. But like you said, there may be some new things that come forward, and maybe some stuff around virtual care, just given how much of that has taken off, and there needs to be maybe some permanent easement of the laws around practicing in multiple jurisdictions and those kinds of things. Again, the federal government doesn't really have jurisdiction over that, but they could put pressure on the states to kind of really adopt this. So especially if the Democrats win. But it'll be interesting. I agree with you. I don't think the election is really going to change too much of the trajectory of health IT. I think the focus, now that we've gone through the Affordable Care Act and we've gone through the whole meaningful use stuff, I don't think there's really a focus from either party to really either spend or change drastically what's happening in the health IT space.
It's a great point about health IT. In fact, it might be the only or near only, I guess we had the pharma one that we mentioned before, but health IT is one of the only bipartisan things out there. They all agree that technology should improve healthcare and should be used, and the information blocking is bad. Like those are things that everyone agrees with. And, how we implement it, how do we monitor it? How do we, should there be enforcement if you are blocking? That's interesting, and I think it will be a thing of discussion. I think the other area that could be really interesting is around privacy. And I'm not sure it will come as a revision to HIPAA, although, HIPAA could be updated for sure. There's an argument there. I think instead it's going to come more as a consumer effort. And so from the consumer perspective, what are the consumer privacy rights that need to be implemented? I think that's going to happen. I think it's going to happen regardless of which party is elected.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned HIPAA. I was laughing the other day because that had not reared its head in the election, of course, until the president's physician used it as a shield when describing his condition. Which, ironically, it was funny because at that moment I did feel for him a little bit, because if the patient, in this case the president, didn't agree for him to disclose it, then he can't disclose it. So he wasn't wrong to say, well, it wasn't because of HIPAA, it was because of his patient said I can't share it. And that is perfectly, a legal and true thing to say, except he invoked the H word, HIPAA, and made it look like the law was responsible versus the individual that was responsible. So up until that point, HIPAA had not reared its head in the election at all, at least to my knowledge. And so it's kind of funny because that thrust it a little bit back into the limelight as people rush to kind of, explain to people again what it was and what it is. And I agree with you. I don't think there's an appetite on either party to open that back up again. Again, I think in the later stages, if whoever wins, they might take a look at it, maybe add or maybe make a couple small changes. But I really don't think it's on anyone's burning agenda that we have a privacy issue in the US around data, other than blocking, right? Other than the ability to share it and use it and the patient's rights to it. So if anything, the one area of privacy that I think would be interesting is big tech. Which is sort of tangential to HIPAA, but it's all the other type of data that they're collecting through, whether that's Amazon or Fitbits and so forth. What is that data, and who governs the use of that? And how clear do you have to be on how you're using that data and where it's going? And because it's not, it's kind of PHI, but not really PHI. And so I think if anything, that will become an area as either, as both governments have, or both parties may take aim at big tech, and that might just sort of get swept up along with it, right? Because there's talk about breaking up Google and breaking up Amazon and all these things, and I think that's just sort of part and parcel with it, right? They just sort of will bury those couple of lines in the law to say, oh, by the way, you can't do this with the health data you're collecting.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. How much Walmart's doing to get into healthcare, how much Amazon's doing to get into healthcare. I think there are some real interesting concerns with big tech. And when it comes to that, I think it is interesting, though, that many of these new laws, especially around the information blocking, are going to enable those big tech companies and startup companies, for that matter, to really be able to do what they need. I know in our recent Expo.Health experience series, Shahid Shah made some great points about the fact that the information blocking essentially says you have to give over the data. And he gave the example, which I'll just repeat here because it was so good. He's like, it can say, compromisesystem.com or, like hacksystem.com. And if I want to share my health data with hacksystem.com, you as a provider organization or you as an EHR vendor has to say, okay, you're the patient and you know better. And maybe hacksystem.com is your own site. So, hey, you as a patient knows that it's not compromised, and maybe that's your mitigation strategy. I don't know. But you literally don't have the choice, which Epic kicked back against this when the legislation came out and said, wait a minute, I have a responsibility to help the patients and to help protect them. And the laws, at least to the current administration, has said, no, if the patient wants to do it, they can.
You got to do it.
So,
yeah.
To Trump's point, right? If Trump wants to share his info, he can. That's kind of the catch-all, get out of jail free card for HIPAA. If the patient says okay, then it's allowed. And so it's really interesting that way, how that's going to enable many of these tech companies to get access to data that they probably wouldn't have had otherwise. Just all they have to do is say, patient, are you okay with this? And if they say yes, they're going to do it.
Hey, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Healthcare IT Today with John Lin and Colin Hung. And today we're talking about politics and its impact of the election potentially on healthcare and health IT. So John, we've talked a lot about, what happens if certain parties win and, with the Medicaid for all and all these things. But what do you think will actually change? Is there something that you think will be impacted by this election or by the parties that get elected?
Yeah, I mean, I still think that the biggest impact probably is going to be around telehealth. There's so much movement around that. Even if you look at, say the Democrats win, I already said if the Republicans win, not much is going to happen. But if the Democrats win, it's going to take them at least a year, maybe 2 years to really, debate it, put it together. It's not like they can just go grab Obamacare and all the things that were stripped away from it and the fundings that were stripped away and just say, they'll do that. Don't get me wrong. They're going to do some of that right away, especially the executive orders from the president if they win. But for the full plan, it's going to take at least a year or two to really do the full legislation. And even then, it's probably more payers, more opportunities, more restrictions to payers. So it likely will impact payers more than it will other organizations. There will be some trickle-down effect to provider organizations as well. But, at the end of the day, if they could get Medicare for all, that would be a different story. I am not even sure how that transition happens. Like, I don't think any of us can really process what a shift to Medicare for all would mean. And like, okay, does that mean insurance companies are gone? And on the bright side, every health IT company would be like, wait, so I only have to integrate with one payer?
One payer. Yeah.
I only have to understand one payer system? Like, there's a argument to be made that Medicare for all for health IT would be wonderful. It would be an incredible innovation, although maybe you have other arguments from Canada where it's still some of the same challenges. I know even just something as simple as having a national patient ID, even in single payer still has challenges.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't have this data, and I want to go back and see if I can find a history book that will tell me. But I wonder if when we enacted our universal health system in Canada, whether there was sort of a rush at the very beginning of people like, okay, I can finally get healthcare, so I'm going to go, right? Because I've been putting it off, or I never got any, and there's this crush of people that never had care that now can go get it, right? But then and then sort of it drops off, right? Because now, okay, I got my care, and now it's sort of everyone else after that is like, this is just normal. I can get care now anytime I want, so I'm not, I think the big fear that a lot of people have under the Medicare for All program is is someone going to abuse the system, right?
Mm.
And in Canada, we actually have there's no upper ceiling. There's no cap to how much you can use the healthcare system. And in a weird way, it worked not having that cap, because it turns out when you have a big enough pool, there are people who never use the healthcare system, and then there are people who are high users. And it worked out because everyone's in the same pool, where it's okay that somebody wants to go to the doctor every other week. And on the other side, there's people who never go. So what I'm getting at is, I think the concern that a lot of people have in the US is sort of in that sort of transition years, where there is going to be this rush and people are just going to crush the healthcare system because they can finally get care, but it evens itself out over time. And I think if they can do something to mitigate that, then I think it would alleviate a lot of people's fears about the whole system collapsing. And because you're right, if everyone just went all of a sudden, it would collapse the system, right? So
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I think there's interesting though, because it kind of reminds me of why people are like, I can't text my patient, or I can't send a portal message I can't get messages from my patient through the portal. They're going to abuse it, and they're going to try to get free care. Like there was all these fears, and we've now proven that, guess what? Most patients don't really care about their health care.
Right.
Like, I'm not like, ooh, it's free, I'm going to go abuse that
I'm
doctor.
going to abuse it now. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we've proven that. I mean, the ones that would abuse it, they're going to abuse you whether the portal message is open. They're going to call 30 times or whatever. I mean,
Right.
like, you have to address those people regardless, right? And so, like, I think it's kind of similar to what you're describing. Like, we don't go for a checkup to the doctor's office because we need a friend,
Right.
like we need some entertainment. Like, that's just not what you do. So that's not my concern. My concern is always, when has government ever got involved in something and it got lower cost, right? Like more efficient. And the real problem is, what are the core things that are making healthcare expensive? If we don't fix those, we talked about drug pricing. If we don't fix those things, then I don't care what system you have, it's going to be too expensive, right? Whether it's Medicare for All, whether it's Obamacare Plus, whether it's our current system with other options, like it, none of them are going to do it if you don't fix the cost problem.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is a little bit sort of adjacent to the problems we've been talking about, John, is the fact that, we are dealing with the pandemic, and both parties, no matter who's elected, is going to have to figure out something in terms of buttressing or supporting the people who have lost their jobs. And there has been millions of people who are out of work and unable to restart work, because if you work in hospitality, that's not coming back. And because of that, they can't get care. Right.
Mhm.
So, the number of bankruptcies, we may be seeing a spike in those due to medication expenses or med expenses. We may see people foregoing care, which seems to be the more the thing that people are doing now. They're just not getting care. So you have this sort of pent up problem that's just rolling down the hill. And whoever gets into power is going to have to deal with that. All of a sudden, you're going to have this crush of people who are declaring bankruptcy, or who are just going to suddenly burden the parts of the Medicare and Medicaid system that is not well funded. So it'll be interesting to see what the parties do, because that's unfortunately where a lot of that funding goes right now, is it goes to pay for the care that people need who aren't able to work. So.
Well, and to your point, we're in a false market. It was buttressed by $3 trillion of stimulus, and a lot of corporations who essentially were doing, taking care of their employees with insurance for another 6 months, even though they were laid off, or, all sorts of programs like that. So once that cliff falls off, I don't think we know what to predict. And, it's hard to see what's going to happen. Will they do another stimulus? I mean, that's a very political question as well. Although I think it is an interesting way to finish up this episode. Do you think there's more stimulus for healthcare organizations who are struggling quite a bit?
Yeah, I think there has to be, because you can't let the healthcare system collapse in the middle of a pandemic. And what we're seeing now is the erosion of all the electives, and thankfully they've come back a little bit. But if we have to go back into lockdown, or should the COVID get worse, which it looks like it will, that will have a big severe impact on revenue. So yeah, I mean, but whether it's you give the money directly to the providers or whether you give it to patients to then go to the providers, who knows?
Sure.
But I think there does have to be some form of aid package for that group because they need it.
Yeah, I just hope it's more targeted. It's really frustrating, the previous one where they'd give hundreds of millions of dollars to someone who has billions in the bank, healthcare organizations.
That's right.
If they don't do something, I think it's going to make the rich richer, and the poor healthcare organizations are going to suffer and probably get bought out, disappear, etc. So that's a sad scenario. So hopefully they do a little something for those that are really suffering, and not just those that, you know, are suffering but have plenty in the bank.
Right. Well, on that note, John, we've come to an end of another episode of Healthcare IT Today. So thank you to all of you who tuned in. You can find out more details about our show by checking out the programs page on healthcarenowradio.com. And please share your voice and engage with the community using the hashtag HITSN or at healthcareittoday.com. I'm Colin Hung with my friend and Health IT collaborator, John Lynn. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.